Welcome to the Vantage Fit Corporate Wellness Podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Vantage Fit, the all-in-one AI-powered corporate wellness platform developed by Vantage Circle.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Vantage Fit Corporate Wellness Podcast. I'm your host Parishmita and we have an emotional intelligence expert to speak on the same today. As we know, emotional intelligence is the capability to identify, manage, and evaluate and understand our own emotions and that of other people around us. So let's discuss further about emotional intelligence with the expert, Brenda Lee. Hi, Brenda. Welcome to our podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
So let me ask you the first question. What is emotional intelligence? How would you enlighten our listeners on the subject?
You know, emotional intelligence is something that doesn't get taught to people in schools. And usually your example is strictly by your parents. And so it's something that is becoming a buzzword. People are starting to understand it, especially since COVID and people were locked down and they understood that your emotional state really matters, right? And so emotional intelligence is basically having a clear understanding of your emotions and where your emotions are coming from and why you're communicating the way that you are and why you're behaving the way that you are, right? 90 to 95% of our decisions are based out of emotions, and people don't realize that. So they're going around every day doing these things, and they don't realize that their emotional intelligence or lack thereof is causing them to have a really crummy life or a really great life.
Yes. So, Brenda, why does emotional intelligence need to be emphasized in the workplaces? Why does it impact how they engage and interact with each other?
Yeah. Well, it's critical, right? Because 90 to 95% of our decisions come out of our emotional state. The way that we communicate with people, the way that we resolve conflict, the way that we approach our boss or not about that promotion, or whether or not we take that risk in business or not is directly impacted by our emotional intelligence. And so if you don't have emotional regulation, you're making most likely some pretty poor choices that are reactive instead of proactive, and the best decision for your company, for your engagement with your employees, and how everybody interacts with each other.
Absolutely. So do you think that it is because of COVID-19 or the post-pandemic scenario, the emotional intelligence or the importance of emotional intelligence has been prioritized more?
Yeah, absolutely. So prior to COVID, everybody tried to separate corporate versus home life, right? Mm-hmm. The reality is we're holistic beings. We can't separate our emotions. Like, you can't get in a fight with your spouse and then go into the boardroom and give a presentation and knock it out of the park. It just doesn't work that way. Our emotions are entangled unless, of course, we have the skill set to put that emotion and put that fight in the box, right? And now switch gears and emotionally step into your corporate space and go into that boardroom. The problem is people haven't been taught how to bridge that and the skill set in order to leave that fight, if you will, at home. And then now you've put everybody back in their home. You put them under lockdown. There was no escape from their people in their house for weeks and weeks on end. And now two different people, if they've got a spouse or their kids or whatever it may be, they're all now rubbing up against each other's different or lack of emotional intelligence, right? And it's causing all kinds of depression, explosion, divorces, everything, which directly impacts people's performance at work. You just can't get away from it. So corporate has finally lifted the veil, if you will, and said, okay, there's something to, like, your personal life really does matter. It is really directly impacting our work life. And now they've bridged that gap. And so COVID, definitely, that was one good thing that came out. It's always been an issue. They've wanted to delineate the two, but you can't. And so COVID caused it to be able to now have that bridge and bridge that gap.
Yes, I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
So coming to the next question. So what are the components of emotional intelligence?
Yeah. So first and foremost is self-awareness, right? Like, and the way that people can do this, and here's a really practical way for people to have self-awareness, start recognizing what you're thinking about other people and yourself. With that monkey mind, or, you know, that negative Nancy that's like on your shoulder, always talking in your ear. When you start paying attention to what that is saying, now you're going to get a really good insight into what your emotions are doing. Your thoughts are derived out of your emotions. So if you start paying attention to your thoughts, now you can get a good insight into what is happening with your emotional state and where you're at. So, but having that self-awareness, people go around all the time and they're like, what voice are you talking about? Some people don't even recognize they have the voice, right? And then when you start talking about, they're like, oh yeah, I do have that voice. And they think it's them. But it's not, right? Like it's social, it's all this other conditioning that they've been taught, and it's not really who they are or what they really believe about themselves. So becoming self-aware is step number one. Once you've become self-aware, now you can get regulated. We call this emotional regulation, where you're stable. That doesn't mean emotional intelligence does not mean being super emotional or completely lacking emotion. Some people think it's lacking emotion and being steady all the time. And that's simply not true. That's actually just as dysfunctional as being too emotional, right? When you come to the balance of the two, you can feel the emotions, you deal with them, you heal them if you need to. Some need to be healed. And then you turn it loose and you're like, okay, so that happened, no big deal. And we often say it's like, you're driving the car instead of the car driving you, right? You're controlling your emotions instead of your emotions controlling you. And that's where that emotional dysregulation comes from on the reactive spectrum anyway, where their emotions are driving them instead of them taking control of that. And vice versa, if you're stuffing them and just pretending they don't exist, that inhibits you as well. And you're now not functioning emotionally healthy either. So it's a two-step process, right? And a lot of psychologists go through 3 or 4 or 5 more steps. And I really keep it simple to the 2. It's self-awareness and now regulating. How we get into the skill set of how you communicate and all that and what drives you in your performance and your motivation, that's more application. But it's really 2 components.
Yes, I agree with you. Like, I also think that hiding our emotions is the biggest obstacle.
Yes.
Even in the workplaces, right? Or in personal space also, in personal relationships also. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. You're half dead. We're emotional creatures and we're supposed to feel these emotions. If we don't know what joy and happiness feels like, how do we know what the pain feels like?
Absolutely.
When you're numb to all of that, you can't experience the joy that life gives us.
Yes. I cannot agree more. Yes.
Yeah.
So Brenda, how can one measure emotional intelligence?
So emotional intelligence is a really tough thing to measure. They try to come out with all these studies and now AI has helped significantly, right? We're able to tap into it in a way that we never could before. However, it's subjective. There is no final 1 + 1 = 2. It doesn't work that way, right? And so really when you're trying to measure some other people's emotional intelligence, you're measuring based off of how emotionally intelligent you are, right? And that is so dysregulated. There's no IQ test where you get a score and you know what you are, right? Because it's also subjective. It's not factual in that regard. Now, science is getting to understand it a lot more with quantum physics and our ability to create our life and all that kind of stuff based out of our emotions and what we attract in our life. But that's still such new research that there's no fundamental way to be able to really measure someone's EQ.
Yes, I can understand that.
Yeah.
So what are the ways to improve emotional intelligence in the workplace?
Well, so communication's critical, right? Learning how to communicate in a way that really causes you to slow down, to think through your response and your answer to people, understanding the facts of the situation. When people are emotionally driven, they're, like I said, reacting and they're responding out of emotions instead of just looking at the facts. So one thing I always teach all my corporate clients and my executive one-on-one clients is, what are the facts of the situation? And when we remove the story, because then what happens is when our emotions get involved, then we start to create a story. And the story is you and I could see the same event happen. Your story about the event is going to be radically different than mine because our stories come out of our emotional intelligence, our life experience, and the conditioning of which we've received, right? So what you might perceive as something awful, I might be like, oh my gosh, that was awesome, right? And so when you have this gap with people, understanding that people in the workplace are coming from a different perspective and giving them space, a judgment-free space in communication and saying, okay, what are the facts, right? The only thing that you and I can determine about that story that is truth is the facts. So when you back off and don't listen to that story, you don't listen to that chirping in your head, that voice in your head, and you start just looking at the facts, that's when you can really progress and then have effective communication of just sticking to those facts. Like, hey, can we agree to stick to the facts here?
So I would like to ask this question. Okay, so as we have talked about conditioning, do you think that behavioral health comes into the play or in the picture in this scene?
Oh, absolutely. So this is, I spend 2 full days. When I do corporate retreats, we talk about what we call a belief cycle, because we've got our 95% subconscious mind, right? And that's like the computer coding, if you will, on the back end of a computer. And I liken this to like pulling up Microsoft Word. You pull Microsoft Word up, you're only seeing 5% of what's going on. You have the template, you get to choose from all these little templates, you hit some magic keys on your keyboard, they magically appear on the screen, and boom, you can print out a piece of paper and you got your novel written, right? Well, that's only 5% of what's happening. There's all this coding and all this work that went into the computer that's processing every split second, that's able to kick out all that information for you. That's like our subconscious brain. When we get into our 95% subconscious brain, it's critical that we understand that subconscious brain has been programmed by what our parents have taught us, by what religion has taught us, by what environment we lived in. And quite frankly, it directly impacts every single decision. That impacts your emotions impact your decisions. So all that conditioning, it's really critical to get to the core of that for people and understand, like, hey, is this something that I really believe? Or is this my parents' religious belief? Is this my boss's belief about how I should show up to work? Is this my, is like corporate? I mean, the whole conversation of how EQ is now in corporate, that in and of itself, COVID broke down conditioning that corporate was subscribing to that said, oh, it's okay to talk about emotions. And this really is important in the corporate place.
Yeah, actually it is.
Yeah.
Like most of us have ignored this bigger picture about this entire thing. Thank you for explaining this so well.
Yeah.
Brenda, thank you so much.
Yeah.
So coming to the next question, can corporate wellness programs help improve emotional intelligence in the workplace?
Absolutely. And quite frankly, that is my mission. I think when we go after the leaders of the world and high level executives and people who are in leadership, it always starts from the top down, right? And so when they, and now that they are open to, and when they latch onto and take this kind of training and they're willing to give it to their employees, you can radically change teams. I mean, we are transforming teams left and right with this emotional intelligence. And quite honestly, that's how I got into this role. Was I was doing a completely different, I was just doing executive coaching, right? One of the entrepreneurs that I was coaching was like, oh my gosh, could you please take this to my team? If my team knew this, it would radically shift the way that we operate. And that's honestly how Modig Leadership was born, right? Like that's how this whole division and this company came into being, because it was requested by someone who saw the value and how you can't put like numbers to this, right? But he was
Absolutely.
like, this radically will change my company. And it did. And every company we work with, it's a whole different level of dynamic that they have. Their profitability, their productivity, their employee engagement, their loyalty of their employees, all of that increases.
Yeah.
Getting the training, getting educated, doing book clubs, like so many of my clients, in fact, one started book clubs, and she asks me all the time, hey, okay, what's the next best book? And the people in the corporate space that are hungry for that, they're going to come to that book club, and they're going to want to be around people that can now speak this language, right? And they can communicate in an effective and healthy way instead of a dysfunctional and aggressive and I have to win way, right? It's a very much more creative and collaborative environment that is cultivated out of having this emotional intelligence.
Yeah, so like I'm asking this personally, what is your, take on how to resolve these issues in the workplaces, or what these workplaces are currently facing regarding emotional intelligence in the workplace?
Well, the solution is training, right? Because like I said, you're not taught this in school. Your example is your parents, and most likely they're dysfunctional, right? Or socially, right? people look at Victoria's Secret magazine or models and they're like, oh my gosh, that must be what I look like. What happened to, this is what I am. This is what I get to embrace. And I'm beautiful and I can be just how I am. Right. And so stepping away from all of that conditioning. And like I said, first step is awareness. When we realize how conditioned we are, and then we start critical thinking and we are thinking for ourselves now we are coming from a less judgmental place. When we've got this standard of how everything should be because of all the conditioning, if it doesn't fit that standard, we're mad, we're judging ourselves. So having that voice in our head saying, oh my God, you're not fit enough. Your boobs aren't big enough, like right? Like using that example. And that's just simply not the case. What if we're created exactly how we're supposed to be? What if we can embrace exactly how we think and how we love and how we care for people? What if it wasn't so rigid, right? And, I'll share this example. This literally just happened yesterday. One of my colleagues here put a post up and he had listed this word and said, ladies, do you see this as derogatory or not? Right. And it's such a benign word. It was no big deal. And everybody responded. There wasn't a single objective response. It was yes or no. Yes, yes, yes. This is derogatory. No, no, no. Yes, yes, yes. No, yes, no. I mean, it was just black and white. Okay. So that we're conditioned in the US here to have this notion that word should mean something derogatory to us. I finally chimed in because I was like, oh my gosh, like it was like this experiment I got to watch where this is how judgmental people are, not only with other people, if they say that word to them, but what that means about them. Because now they make the story and it's attached to the conditioning. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Where like the way they responded is attached to the conditioning they've received about that word. I pipe in and I was like, well, it totally depends. If my man said that to me, I know it's coming out of love and banter and teasing, and I'm okay with it. And it is not derogatory in any way. But if someone calls me that with a nasty tone and their motivation behind it is ugly, then I know it's a derogatory way to speak to me. But it's the heart motivation that matters. But because of their judgment and their attachment to conditioning, it was black and white for them. So tying that back into the corporate space, that's how people are communicating with each other. It's so black and white instead of, okay, let's take a breath here. Is that what you really meant? I think when you say that maybe you mean I'm not good enough at my job. Is that what you meant? And when we ask the questions, they're going to say, no, that's not at all what I meant. I was meaning that the performance on this particular project wasn't to my expectation. Maybe I didn't make my expectations clear. And now there's open dialogue and now you get to a solution instead of people secretly being mad at each other and thinking they're not good enough and thinking they suck at their job and now looking for a different job and now your employee loyalment and now they're no longer loyal and they're checking out and they're shopping for a job somewhere else. All out of emotional intelligence.
Absolutely. So I also believe that having mindful connections is very much important, as you have talked about workplaces, how it's all about black and white. So I think mindful connections come into picture and it plays a very important role in emotional intelligence also, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They go hand in hand. And somebody even posed a question recently. I saw this on social media as well. Is emotional intelligence more important than intellect, right? Like than just smart intelligence? And it's like, yeah, absolutely. And the reason I can say that is because I had a dad who was off the charts brilliant, but socially we couldn't even have a relationship. And I didn't get to enjoy him the way that I would have liked to because he was so smart, but lacked the emotional intelligence, right? Because emotional intelligence, we're relational human beings. Everybody you engage with, we want to think at work that we don't have relationships. You're in relationship with the person in the cubicle next to you, with your boss, with your subordinate. You're in relationship with everyone. It doesn't mean you're married and you're going home to them. And people often associate, well, relationship means a partner, a spouse, a life partner, whatever. That's not the case. We're in relationship with that person that we pass on the street. And how we engage with those people, it directly impacts our mindful intelligence and where we stand and how we can give those gifts to the world. If we can't be in relationship well with those people, we can't give the intellect to people at all. In an effective way, anyway, usually.
Absolutely. I agree with you.
Yeah.
So, Brenda, coming to the last question, would you like to suggest to our listeners about emotional intelligence, or the employees who are working 9 to 5 in a workplace on emotional intelligence?
Yeah. So here's the deal. Like I said, and I said this already, just start being self-aware of your thoughts. When you start becoming aware of your thoughts, and then stop the stories. The emotions are tied to our thoughts. So when you check into your thoughts, you're going to see where your emotional home is, right? When you're constantly having negative thoughts, you're stuck in negative emotions. When you're able to have happy thoughts and you're thinking the best of other people and you're excited about your workday, now you're switching the gears, because the statistics say 70 to 80% of our thoughts are negative, right? 90 to 95% of those are on repeat every single day. So the faster you can stop that belief cycle that we teach, and it's a whole different deal, but when the faster you can stop that, get your thoughts in check, now your emotions will start to come in alignment with those. And you can shift the way you engage with people. You can look for the positive in people and ask inquisitive questions. Curiosity is gone, right? Like we've all kind of become everybody stood in line and took the marching orders and did whatever they told us. And that curiosity is missing. When you start getting curious about other people and asking those questions, like I said, like, hey, I understood that you meant this about me. Is that really what you meant? And now you open that dialogue with your coworker or your boss or whoever, and you've just elevated in their eyes. They're like, oh, whoa, like that's a pretty deep question. People don't ask that, right? And now you're setting yourself apart, and they're going to start observing your behavior and how that changes the way in which you engage with them. And as a result, also your performance at work.
I think you're right, because, most of the time we are so much negative. We are full of negative thoughts and everything, right? But I think we should really work upon this thing, how to change ourselves before we change the world or things around us, right?
It starts with us. I say this all the time, you can only give or get what you have for yourself. If you don't have self-respect, if you don't have happy thoughts, if you aren't excited about what you do, you can't give that to your partner, to your friend, the guy in the cubicle over, to your boss, to your project at work. You can't give what you don't have. It starts with us.
Like you give enough, you get enough, right?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yep. And that's true. That's a great point. The more we give, I don't understand. I don't get quantum physics is above my pay grade, but the more it comes back, I just don't understand it. Awesome.
Thank you so much, Brenda, for coming to our show.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
It was so nice talking to you. It was enlightening.
Yeah.
I hope our listeners will love it.
Yep. I hope so too. I hope so. I hope it gives them some encouragement. Stop the thoughts. Change your thoughts. Yes. That's my final word.
This was such a positive way to start your day, and such a positive, way to end my day with. Thank you so much, Brenda. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Vantage Fit Corporate Wellness Podcast. Please do subscribe to Vantage Fit Corporate Wellness Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and our YouTube channel for new episodes.